Cigarette smoke hung thick enough to choke a ghost inside the rusty anchor. Pool balls clacked, heavy boots scraped the floorboards, and gritty laughter echoed from leather-clad giants. Then, a 10-year-old boy placed a tarnished silver lighter on the sticky mahogany. In a heartbeat, 30 hardened outlaws froze completely. Dust swirled around Toby Harris's battered sneakers as he trudged down the sun-baked shoulder of Route 99. At 10 years old, Toby was small for his age, with sharp collarbones jutting from beneath a faded corduroy jacket that was 3 sizes too big. In his right pocket rested a heavy canvas pouch. It clinked softly with every step, a metallic rhythm that matched his racing heartbeat. It was 1988 in Bakersfield, California, and the summer heat was unforgiving. But the heat wasn't what had driven Toby out to the industrial outskirts of town. It was the stack of final notice bills sitting on his mother's kitchen table. Sarah Harris had been working double shifts at the local diner until her lungs gave out, leaving her tethered to an oxygen tank and a terrifyingly empty bank account. Toby knew they had 2 weeks before the bank took the house. Desperation had led him to tear up the loose floorboards in the attic of their rented bungalow. He had been looking for loose change, maybe some forgotten emergency cash. Instead, he found a dusty, iron-bound lockbox hidden between the joists. Inside were remnants of a man he barely knew, his father, Richard Harris, who had supposedly died in a fiery car crash when Toby was just an infant. The box held a brass compass, an ornate pocket watch that no longer ticked, a heavy gold ring, and a strange silver lighter. Toby had tried the pawn shops downtown, but the greasy men behind the reinforced glass had taken one look at a skinny kid and offered him pennies. He needed real money. He needed buyers who didn't care where things came from, men who carried thick rolls of cash and lived outside the rules. That logic, dangerously naive, brought him to the gravel parking lot of the Rusty Anchor. Over 24 custom Harley-Davidson choppers were lined up out front, their chrome pipes gleaming like bared teeth in the afternoon sun. This was undisputed Hells Angels territory. Everyone in Bakersfield knew you didn't look at the anchor, you didn't park near the anchor, and you certainly didn't walk through its heavy oak doors unless you were wearing the winged death head on your back. Toby pushed the heavy door open. It creaked in protest, groaning like an old ship. The sensory assault was immediate. The air was a suffocating blend of stale, Pabst Blue Ribbon, cheap whiskey, sweat and exhaust fumes. The jukebox in the corner was blasting a gritty ZZ Top track, but the music barely pierced the low, rumbling din of male voices. Massive men in denim and leather vests occupied the booths and the long mahogany bar. California bottom rockers proudly declared their charter. Heavy silver chains hung from their belts, and switchblade handles peeked from denim pockets. A few heads turned as the door shut behind the boy. Hard, unforgiving eyes scanned him. Toby felt his knees weaken, but the image of his mother's pale face pushed him forward. He walked up to the bar. The bartender, a burly, scarred man named Sal, was wiping down the counter with a dirty rag. Sal looked down, his thick brows furrowing in disbelief. "You lost, kid?" Sal rumbled, his voice like gravel grinding in a cement mixer. "Chuck E. Cheese is about 10 miles back that way." "I'm not lost, sir," Toby squeaked, his voice betraying his fear. He cleared his throat and tried to stand taller. "I have things to sell. Antiques. I was hoping someone here might want to buy them." A bark of harsh laughter erupted from a nearby stool. Arthur Bones Harrison, the chapter's sergeant-at-arms, pivoted on his seat. Bones was a towering figure, his arms completely covered in crude jailhouse tattoos, his face split by a jagged scar that ran from his ear to his jawline. "Antiques?" Bones chuckled, stepping off the stool. He towered over Toby like a redwood tree. "What kind of operation you running? Half pint? You fencing stolen goods from the middle school, lost and found?" Several other bikers chuckled, turning their attention to the bizarre spectacle of a child standing in the middle of an outlaw stronghold. "They're not stolen," Toby said, his hands shaking as he reached into his oversized jacket pocket. "They were my dad's. I need the money for my mum. She's sick." Bones crossed his massive arms, amused but slightly irritated by the interruption to his afternoon drinking. "Listen, kid. I don't care if your mum has the bubonic plague. This ain't a flea market. Put your junk away and get out the door before someone accidentally steps on you." "Just look," Toby pleaded, pulling the heavy canvas pouch from his pocket. He dumped the contents directly onto the sticky mahogany bar. The brass compass clattered loudly. The gold ring rolled in a tight circle before settling. And then the heavy, tarnished silver Zippo lighter hit the wood with a dull, resonant thud. Bones glanced lazily at the pile of items. He reached out with a massive, grease-stained hand to push the junk back toward the kid. But as his fingers brushed the silver Zippo, his hand stopped abruptly. The air around Bones seemed to drop 10 degrees. He picked up the lighter, his eyes narrowing as he brought it closer to the dim light hanging above the bar. It was a heavy-duty, custom-cast Zippo, much thicker than a standard model. Time and neglect had blackened the silver, but the deep engraving on the front was unmistakable. It wasn't a standard Hell's Angels logo. It was a winged skull, but the skull's lower jaw was completely missing, shattered off in the design, and intertwined through the eye sockets was a broken chain. Beneath the skull, deeply etched in a jagged Gothic script, were the initials EC. Bones's face went entirely pale. The amusement vanished from his eyes, replaced by a look of profound, terrifying shock. He slowly lowered the lighter, his gaze snapping down to the 10-year-old boy. "Sal," Bones whispered. His voice was barely audible, but the absolute lack of humor in it made the bartender freeze. "Yeah, Bones. Unplug the jukebox." Sal didn't ask questions. He reached under the counter and yanked the heavy black cord. The Zezzy top track died instantly, winding down with a pathetic mechanical groan. The sudden cessation of music was like a gunshot. Conversations across the bar abruptly halted. Pool cues were lowered. 30 pairs of eyes instantly locked onto the bar. In the outlaw biker world, when the sergeant-at-arms cuts the music, violence or vital business is about to occur. Toby swallowed hard, shrinking back a step. The silence in the room was heavier than the noise had been. It felt suffocating, dangerous. "Where did you get that?" Bones asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He wasn't looking at Toby anymore. He was staring at the lighter as if it were an unexploded bomb. "I told you," Toby stammered, terrified he had brought something illegal. "It was in my dad's old box, in the attic." "Mickey," Bones called out, not taking his eyes off the lighter. "Go get the Reaper, now." Mad. Mickey Gallagher, a wiry biker with a wild mane of red hair, practically sprinted toward the heavy steel door at the back of the bar. He hammered on it twice before throwing it open and disappearing into the back room. The bar remained dead silent. No one moved. No one drank. The only sound was the heavy, rhythmic thumping of the ceiling fan overhead. Toby felt tears pricking the corners of his eyes, but he bit his lip, refusing to cry. A moment later, the steel door opened again. Silas Reaper Cole stepped out. Silas was the president of the Bakersfield Charter. He didn't look like the rest of the men. He wore no chaotic tattoos on his face, and his leather cut was meticulously clean. He moved with a quiet, lethal grace that commanded absolute, unquestioning authority. He had silver hair tied back in a tight tail, and eyes the color of chipped flint. The crowd parted for him instantly, clearing a path to the bar. Silas walked up next to Bones. "What is it, Arthur?" Silas asked quietly. Bones didn't speak. He simply opened his hand, revealing the tarnished silver lighter resting on his palm. Silas stopped breathing. Toby watched the massive president of the Hells Angels stare at the small piece of metal. Silas slowly reached out, his fingers visibly trembling, a sight none of the men in that room had ever witnessed. He picked up the Zippo. His thumb traced the missing jaw of the skull, then brushed over the initials. ERC. 15 years ago, in the violent summer of 1973, Elias Cole, Silas's older brother and the founder of the Bakersfield Charter, had vanished without a trace. It was during a bloody turf war with the Mongols. The Angels had turned the state upside down, shedding blood across 3 counties looking for him. They never found a body. They never found a bike. Elias, and the legendary custom silver Zippo he was never seen without, had simply ceased to exist, until a 10-year-old boy dropped it onto the bar. Silas slowly lifted his head. His flinty eyes locked onto Toby. The intensity of his gaze was enough to make a grown man beg for mercy. "Son," Silas said, his voice terrifyingly calm, smooth as glass over jagged rocks. "I am going to ask you a question, and your life, and the life of whoever gave this to you, depends on you telling me the exact truth." Toby nodded frantically, unable to find his voice. "Where did you get that?" Silas asked, echoing Bones, but with the weight of a 15-year-old ghost behind the words. "My dad," Toby whispered, a tear finally escaping and cutting a clean path down his dusty cheek. "It was in his box. We have no money. I was just trying to sell it." Silas leaned over the bar, bringing his face level with the boys. The smell of leather and mint tobacco washed over Toby. "Who is your father, boy?" Silas demanded softly. "What is his name?" Toby gripped the edge of the bar, trying to stop his hands from shaking. "His name was Richard Harris." A murmur rippled through the frozen bikers. Bones looked at Silas, confusion etching his scarred face. "Reaper, you know a Richard Harris?" Silas stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving Toby. The color had drained from his face, leaving him looking like a carved marble statue. He didn't answer Bones. He just kept staring at the boy, studying the shape of Toby's jaw, the color of his eyes, the unruly shock of brown hair. "Richard Harris died in a car crash," Toby added quickly, hoping the tragedy would somehow soften these terrifying men. "When I was a baby, I never knew him. My mum just kept his things." Silas closed his fist around the silver lighter, gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white. He looked back at the steel door of his office, then back at the boy. The pieces of a violent, decades-old puzzle were rapidly colliding in his mind, and the picture they were forming was impossible. "Your mother," Silas said, his voice cracking just a fraction. "What is her name?" "Sarah," Toby answered. "Sarah Harris." Silas turned his head sharply. "Bones, lock the front doors. Pull the bikes around back. Nobody leaves." The bar erupted into frantic motion. Deadbolts slammed shut. Blinds were violently yanked down over the neon signs in the windows. Silas reached across the bar and gently, but firmly, placed a hand on Toby's thin shoulder. "Pick up your things, Toby. You and I are going for a ride." Silas's heavy boots crunched against the gravel as he guided Toby out through the reinforced steel back door of the rusty Anchor. The oppressive, blinding heat of the Bakersfield afternoon hit them like a physical wall, but the 10-year-old boy barely registered the temperature. His heart was hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against his ribs. He had come here to pawn some old junk, and instead he had seemingly summoned the wrath of the most dangerous men in California. Waiting in the alleyway was a pristine, midnight black Chevrolet Silverado. Silas opened the heavy passenger door and gestured for Toby to climb up into the cab. A moment later, Bones and Mad Mickey emerged from the bar, straddling their custom Harleys. With a synchronized, deafening roar that rattled the corrugated tin roofs of the nearby warehouses, the two massive V-twin engines fired to life. Silas slid behind the steering wheel of the truck, the engine purring with suppressed, muscular power. "Put your seatbelt on, son," Silas instructed, his voice entirely devoid of the violent menace that usually characterized his orders. He placed the heavy silver Zippo on the center console, positioning it exactly between them. It sat there like a holy relic, catching the harsh sunlight. "Give me the directions to your house." Toby pointed down Route 99, his hand still trembling slightly. The drive began in suffocating silence. The air conditioning in the Silverado blasted cold air, drying the nervous sweat on Toby's forehead. Outside his window, the familiar, sun-bleached landscape of the San Joaquin Valley blurred past, but the boy's attention was entirely locked on the man beside him. Silas drove with a rigid, white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel. His flinty eyes stared straight ahead, burning a hole through the windshield. His mind was a chaotic storm of grief, rage, and an impossible, desperate hope. 15 years. For 15 years, the Bakersfield Charter had honored the memory of Elias Cole, believing he had been ambushed and slaughtered by the Mongols Motorcycle Club during a brutal territory dispute. They had bled for Elias. They had exacted terrible, violent revenge in his name. The idea that his older brother might have survived, that he might have simply walked away and changed his name, was a betrayal that violated the deepest, most sacred codes of the outlaw brotherhood. "Tell me about Richard Harris," Silas said quietly, not taking his eyes off the road. Toby swallowed hard, tracing the stitching on his battered corduroy jacket. "I don't know much, sir. Mom never liked to talk about him. It made her too sad. She told me he was a good mechanic. She said he could fix anything that had an engine. And she said he was very brave." Silas's jaw tightened so hard, a muscle twitched near his temple. A good mechanic. Elias had been the master builder for the club, the only man who could tear down a shovel-head motor blindfolded and put it back together perfectly. The puzzle pieces were snapping into place with violent, undeniable force. The small convoy turned off the main highway, navigating a maze of increasingly dilapidated residential streets. The houses here were tired, their paint peeling under the relentless California sun, their front yards surrendered to weeds and cracked dirt. Toby pointed toward a small, beige bungalow at the end of a dead-end street. The roof sagged in the middle, and a rusted chain-link fence surrounded the property. Silas parked the Silverado against the curb. Bones and Mickey pulled up right behind him, cutting their engines. The sudden silence that followed the deafening roar of the Harleys felt heavy and ominous. Neighbors peeked through drawn blinds, their eyes widening in absolute terror at the sight of the leather-clad giants invading their quiet, broken street. "Wait here with the bikes," Silas ordered Bones and Mickey as he stepped out of the truck. He walked around to the passenger side and helped Toby down. "Lead the way, Toby." Toby pushed open the squeaking front gate and walked up the cracked concrete path. He turned the doorknob. The locks had been broken for months, and pushed the front door open. The air inside the house was stale, smelling faintly of bleach and stale chicken soup. But the dominant sound was the rhythmic, mechanical whoosh hiss of an oxygen concentrator working overtime in the corner of the small living room. Sarah Harris was sitting in a faded floral armchair by the window, a crocheted blanket draped across her thin legs despite the summer heat. Clear plastic tubing ran from the machine to her nostrils. She looked incredibly fragile, her skin pale and translucent, with dark, exhausted circles bruising the skin under her eyes. At 32, the severe illness had aged her a decade. "Toby?" Sarah coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "Where have you been, sweetheart? I was starting to get worried." Her voice trailed off. Her eyes bypassed her son and landed entirely on the towering, imposing figure of Silas Cole standing in her doorway. The blood completely drained from Sarah's already pale face. Her hands instinctively clamped down on the armrests of her chair. She recognized the winged death head on his leather vest. She recognized the silver chains, the rough denim, and the aura of barely contained violence. But more than anything, she recognized the face, the sharp jawline, the flinty eyes, the proud, stubborn set of his shoulders. He looked exactly like a ghost she had buried 9 years ago. Silas slowly walked into the living room, taking off his sunglasses. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the tarnished silver Zippo, and placed it gently on the battered wooden coffee table directly in front of her. "My name is Silas Cole," he said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper that seemed to vibrate in the small room. "I am the president of the Bakersfield Hells Angels. And I believe, Mom, that you were married to my brother." Sarah stared at the lighter. A choked, devastated sob escaped her throat. She closed her eyes, tears leaking out from beneath her eyelashes, and nodded slowly. He told me that if you ever found out, it would mean the end of everything." "Start talking, Sarah," Silas commanded, pulling up a rickety wooden dining chair and sitting down heavily. "I need the truth, every single piece of it." "Where is Elias?" Sarah took a shaky breath, reaching out with a trembling hand to pull Toby close to her side. The boy clung to his mother, his wide eyes darting between her tears and the terrifying man sitting across from them. "He's gone, Silas," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of a decade-old secret. "Richard, Elias, he died in 1979. 9 years ago. It really was a car crash." Silas closed his eyes, his massive shoulders slumping slightly. Hearing it confirmed, knowing for absolute certain that his blood was gone from this earth, was a fresh, agonizing wound. But the anger, the sharp sting of betrayal, flared up immediately alongside the grief. "Why?" Silas demanded, leaning forward, the leather of his vest creaking loudly in the quiet room. "Why did he run? He was the founder of this charter. He was my brother. We bled for him, Sarah. We tore this city apart looking for his body. Desertion is a death sentence in our world. Why would he do that to us? To me?" Sarah wiped her face, her chin trembling, but a sudden flash of fierce, maternal defiance entered her eyes. "Because of me," she said firmly. "And because of Toby." She pointed to the silver Zippo on the table. "He met me in the spring of 73. I was a waitress at a diner 2 towns over. He never wore his colors when he came to see me. He kept his 2 lives completely separate. But then, I got pregnant." Sarah paused, letting the rhythmic whoosh hiss of the oxygen machine fill the silence. Elias knew the life he was living. He knew the violence, the prison time, the constant looking over his shoulder. He told me he couldn't bring a child into that crossfire. So when the war with the Mongols broke out that summer, he saw an opportunity. He dumped his bike in a quarry lake, walked away with nothing but the clothes on his back and that silver lighter, and he became Richard Harris. He sacrificed his entire identity so he could be a father. Silas stared at her, the rigid muscles in his jaw working furiously. The Hells Angels demanded absolute loyalty. The patch came before God, before country, and before family, Elias had broken the highest law of their existence. By all the rules that governed Silas's brutal world, the memory of Elias Cole should be erased, his name cursed, and this family left to fend for themselves as outcasts. "But that's not the whole truth, Silas," Sarah continued, her voice dropping to an urgent, desperate whisper. "The car crash in '79. It wasn't an accident." Silas's head snapped up, his flinty eyes locking onto hers. "What are you talking about?" "Elias was driving home from the auto shop late one night," Sarah explained, a fresh wave of tears spilling down her cheeks. "He was stopped at a red light on Highway 58. A truck pulled up next to him. Inside was a Mongol, an older guy, someone who recognized him from the old days. Elias saw the man reaching for a shotgun under the seat. Silas's fists clenched so tightly his leather gloves groaned. Elias knew that if the Mongols found out he was alive, they wouldn't just kill him," Sarah choked out. "They would track him back to our house. They would slaughter me. They would kill Toby in his crib just to wipe out his bloodline." So, Elias didn't run. He slammed his foot on the gas, turned his wheel, and drove his own car head-on into the side of the Mongol's truck at 70 miles an hour. He pushed them both right off the overpass. The room went dead silent, save for the hum of the medical equipment. Silas sat frozen, the revelation washing over him like a bucket of ice water. Elias hadn't died a coward hiding from his past. He had died a warrior, executing a deliberate, brutal suicide mission to protect his innocent family from the sins of his former life. He had sacrificed his brotherhood to create Toby, and he had sacrificed his life to save him. Silas looked down at Toby. The boy was staring at him, terrified, small, and wearing worn-out clothes. But as Silas really looked at the boy's sharp collarbones, the stubborn set of his jaw, and the fierce intelligence in his eyes, he didn't see a stranger. He saw Elias. The silence was broken by the heavy, thudding footsteps of Arthur Bones Harrison walking into the house. The massive sergeant-at-arms stepped into the living room, holding a stack of papers he had picked up off the kitchen counter. "Reaper," Bones rumbled, his scarred face grim. "I took a look at the mail on the counter. The bank is foreclosing on this place on Friday. And these medical bills, they're burying her. They've got nothing." Silas slowly stood up. He picked up the heavy silver Zippo from the coffee table. He didn't put it in his own pocket. Instead, he reached out and gently dropped it into the oversized front pocket of Toby's corduroy jacket. "Keep it, Toby," Silas said, his voice thick with an emotion the president of the Hells Angels rarely allowed himself to feel. "It belongs to the son of Elias Cole." Silas turned to Bones. The authority radiated off him in waves. "Bones, ride back to the clubhouse. Open the chapter's safe. Take out whatever we have in the emergency reserve. I want every single one of these medical bills paid off in cash by sundown. I want the mortgage on this house bought outright from the bank by tomorrow morning." Bones didn't hesitate. He didn't question the logic of spending club money on a stranger. He simply nodded his massive, tattooed head. "Consider it done, boss," Sarah gasped, pressing her hands to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. "Silas, no, you don't owe us that. You can't do that." "I am not doing it for you, Sarah," Silas said, his tone leaving absolutely no room for argument. "I am doing it because the boy carries my brother's blood. In our world, a debt of blood is absolute. Elias paid his dues in full when he took out that Mongol to keep you safe. Now, it's my turn to look after my own." Silas walked toward the front door, pausing on the threshold. He looked back at Toby, who was gripping the edge of his mother's chair, the heavy silver lighter weighing down his pocket. "You listen to me, Toby," Silas commanded gently. "You're going to stay in school. You're going to take care of your mother. And if anyone in this town, a landlord, a bank, or anybody else, ever gives you an ounce of trouble, you come down to the Rusty Anchor and you ask for your Uncle Silas. Do you understand me?" Toby nodded furiously, wiping a tear from his cheek. "Yes, sir." Silas offered a single, curt nod, then walked out the door. The roaring engines of the Harleys echoed down the street, shaking the foundation of the house. But for the first time in his life, Toby didn't find the noise terrifying. He found it comforting. The rusty silver Zippo never returned to the attic. It stayed in Toby's pocket, a heavy reminder of a father's brutal sacrifice and an uncle's fierce loyalty. Sarah's suffocating medical bills vanished overnight, paid in untraceable cash, and the bank never called again. For the rest of his childhood, Toby Harris walked the dusty streets of Bakersfield completely untouched, shadowed always by the thunderous, protective roar of the Hells Angels.